Hi everyone, welcome to Kinesiology 2030, and this is lecture 8 on movement. So this is a standalone lecture, which means there is no chapter in our textbook that's associated with. This is just a lecture that I created to help you guys understand a little bit more about what movement is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions with movement because we believe movement and exercise is the same thing, or physical activity and movement is the same thing. But really what movement is something we need to adopt more in our everyday lifestyle. Not so much a set time frame where we exercise at a certain intensity like what exercise is. Movement is just something we should be able to do throughout the day comfortably and without restriction. And right now we live in a society where movement is really not necessary. We can accomplish everything almost without movement, and that's starting to create a lot of restrictions within our body. And that's why we see mobility decreasing in people, and we see injuries going up in people, and we also see the diseases of civilization that are starting to really dominate the causes of death in our society. So movement essentially is just something that we should be doing throughout the day regularly instead of sitting. And if we do sit for a long period of time, we should incorporate movement vitamins or movement breaks into our day so we break up that potentially damaging causes of sitting. So what this lecture's goal really is to stress the importance of movement in our everyday life and also make sure that we know that there's a difference between movement and exercise. So the first thing I want to do is actually talk about that, movement and exercise. So a lot of the times, and I get questions a lot about movement and exercise, and people really thinking that they're the same thing. But what we need to understand is, in order to achieve optimal physical health, the body requires exposure to a balanced array of movement nutrients, which can be classified under the categories of quantity, quality, and variety. So movement can be broadly defined as our physical interaction with the environment, and it includes everything the human body is capable of. Although some people consider exercise to be synonymous with movement, it would be a mistake to consider them one and the same. Exercise is a subset of movement, a narrow band of movement that you will see people doing in most gyms. Squats, treadmills, running, bench press, lunges, bicep curls, chin-ups. You can fill in the rest. Although exercise isn't bad for you, only consuming exercise as your only source of movement nutrition will leave you malnourished. Similar, if we look at carrots. Carrots are not bad for you, but if that's all you ate, you'd be missing a lot of nutrients that are required for your body to function optimally. So movement encompasses many activities that would be considered exercise. So something like picking food from a garden, shoveling snow off the driveway. These are all considered movement, but have much more variety and practicality than exercise. So we need to make sure we help people take a broader perspective when it comes to movement. Exercising is great, but it cannot be viewed as an adequate supplement for a lack of daily movement in your life. So if you look at someone like me, who is a strength and conditioning coach, a kinesiologist, exercise is a very important part of my profession. And I believe exercise is what keeps us young, it keeps us healthy, it keeps us moving. Exercise is fantastic. But we have to realize that exercise isn't the only thing that's going to keep us optimally healthy. We have to incorporate movement. Now, what I mean by this difference between movement and exercise, I feel can be best explained in this little circle chart that I have right here. So if we draw a circle, all right, and we color it in, okay? So if we say this circle is movement, these are all the different movements that we should do in the day. If we take a look at exercise, exercise is only going to make up a very small part of our total movement throughout the day. So that's what the real difference between movement and exercise is. Exercise is this set, planned workout where we do a certain amount of reps and a certain amount of weight, or run a certain distance at a certain heart rate. All right, exercise is more specific to some goal that you want to achieve in fitness. Movement is the all-encompassing aspect of our life that we should be doing regularly. So what we should be trying to do is avoid sitting and moving more. So we look at movement and how we fill the circle of movement throughout the day. It could be anything from, walking your dog, or it could be going in a squat position while you read a book, or it could be walking up the stairs versus taking an elevator. So what essentially movement is we're trying to eliminate sitting, because sitting is something that is really becoming a massive problem in our society. So yes, absolutely exercise is important, but movement is more important, and movement is what we should be filling our day with. All right? And I get a lot of questions with, uh, because of school and work, I have to sit a lot. I don't feel like I can move as much as I would like to, or exercise as much as I would like to. Then we have to get into that engineering your environment. Well, how are you going to engineer your environment to make sure that you move more and sit less? So there's lots of things we can do. We can go on the extreme side of things, which some people do, which is completely remove couches and chairs out of their house so they don't have an option to sit. Or we can do a more conventional thing, like what I do, which is have a yoga mat in my living room, or have a yoga mat, in my bedroom, just where I can see it, and I know, okay, instead of sitting on this couch, I'm going to go and do some mobility work or some flexibility work on my yoga mat instead of sitting. So we have this expression, the living room. Right? And that's what we need to make it. Right now, we're making our living rooms into a sitting room. We have these nice, comfortable couches. We have this nice TV that we can sit and watch. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, because absolutely sitting has its place and it's important. It's good to be able to sit, relax, and just chill out for a while. But what we need to do is go back to our living rooms to be just that, a living room, a room where you're alive, a room where you are being productive in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be working or reading or doing something. Just if you need some time to sit and watch a show or watch a movie, then, engineer your environment so you can be productive while watching it, right? By sitting on the ground or doing some stretches, or maybe half the movie sit on the couch, the other half do some stretches, anything like that. So what we need to do is really make our environment more conducive to movement versus less conducive to movement, because that's what's happening right now. You can get your groceries delivered to you. You can go on Amazon and get what you need delivered to you. You can literally survive without leaving the house now. And what we need to do is make sure that we're still incorporating our movement vitamins, our movement snacks, our movement nutrients to make sure that our body is getting the supplementation of movement that we need. Now, this here is a fantastic example of what sitting is doing to us. All right, so if you look at what movement used to be a way of life. Movement was how our ancestors used to travel to different places from town to town or city to city based on, where their survival was going to be the best, where they were going to have the most food available to them, the best shelter available to them. And if something happened to that area, they moved around, or they moved to get food, or they moved to create their environment to be secure. Right? So movement used to be a way of life. But then all of a sudden we started figuring out how we can make other things move for us. So we wouldn't have to do the moving. We wouldn't have to use our 2 feet to move, right? Or we wouldn't have to use our hands and arms and legs to climb. We started creating things to move for us. Cars, bikes. I mean, bikes, you're still exerting energy, but, like cars, ladders to climb, all these different devices and these different concepts that just started creating our movement to decline. So movement really became unnecessary. And right now, it's unnecessary. And then the other thing that we decided to do is invent a chair, because sitting in a chair is a lot easier than squatting down and reading a book, or squatting down and cleaning your clothes, right? So now we have a chair that's sitting. And at first no one really understood it was a big deal, right? We just sat and then that was fine, and no one really thought about it, right? But now what we're starting to understand is sitting is actually detrimental to our health. I actually believe that sitting is becoming the new smoking. If we continue to sit at the rate we're sitting, humans, millions of years from now, are going to evolve into completely different beings because of what we're doing to the shape of our body by sitting too much. So we need to make sure that we stand, because if we sit too much, then what we're actually doing is creating a higher risk of morbidity and mortality, right? So we're actually decreasing our lifespan and decreasing our quality of life by sitting. Now, one thing a lot of people don't understand, and I've mentioned this before, is, well, I exercise regularly, so that offsets all the sitting I do. Well, research right now is indicating that in order to offset 8 hours of sitting in a day, you must exercise 60 to 75 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity. Now, that's almost twice as much as the current minimum recommendation. So if we can just reduce sitting, we're actually enhancing our health. And we can use just movement as a health enhancing strategy. Now, what I have up here is this blood glucose level and what happens after you sit with a meal. Sit after a meal. Now, this is what's really causing a massive problem with disease of civilization, because we're starting to see all these studies that are showing our glucose control after food consumption is terrible when we eat and then we sit. All right? So what's going on is we're getting these highs and these lows. We're not really staying in the optimal concentration range of a healthy range for blood glucose levels. We're going too high, we're going too low, we're going back up too high. Because what's happening is we're getting these spikes because we're not moving. And what glucose essentially is energy to help us move. And if we eat food, what we're doing is giving ourselves energy to move. And what happens is we eat this food, we sit, and we just get spikes and lows, and that wreaks havoc with our pancreas and with insulin regulation and insulin control. So these glucose levels will spike too high, they'll dip too low. And what we want to do is actually move more, because studies are actually demonstrating that light intensity walking is going to improve glucose control after food consumption. And it's due to the fact simply that we have working muscles utilizing glucose, keeping it at optimal levels, versus the spikes and drops that are caused when we're sitting. So by simply just moving after a meal, we will considerably increase our health and our ability to regulate glucose. But if we just sit after a meal, most people sit, while they eat, and then they continue to sit after they eat. And that's what's really starting the diabetes epidemic, is because we're sitting too much after eating. And by sitting, we're decreasing the amount of energy that we need and decreasing the amount of energy that's required. But we're eating energy as if we need abundance of it. All right. One thing, and we'll talk about this when we get into nutrition, is our body wants to store energy. Like, it wants to store energy because of what our ancestors had to do when they didn't have food readily available. Right? So they weren't able to go to a store and just buy what they wanted and eat it. They had to go hunt. They had to go get the rabbits that they wanted to eat. They had to go find the fruit they wanted to eat. And so they may have gone 48, 72 hours without a meal because they just didn't have supply at that time. And so our body has adjusted over millions of years to store as much energy as possible. And right now, we just can eat whenever we want because we have food readily available, and we don't understand that our body wants to actually store it. So when we eat a meal, we need to utilize that energy. And we can utilize it just by simply moving more, just walking, doing some sort of light activity. And that's going to help control our glucose levels. So really, if we think about it, sitting isn't life, movement is life. And we need to change what evolution might look like a million years from now. We might be getting these hunched back individuals that have tight hips and short calf muscles because of the way we sit right now. We need to reclaim our movement because movement is life. Every single thing we do from birth until death involves some kind of movement. Whether it's walking, talking, eating, breathing, even laughing, or anything between that, it all involves movement in some capacity. In fact, the only reason for a brain is really to help perform complex and adaptable movements. Humans have the largest brains in the animal kingdom relative to the body size. But so we have this great potential for movements. Great potential for movements, right? So if you look at an example of that, it's our ability to make tools and technology and to use complex language. So this capacity for movement has led to our dominance of the animal kingdom and the world at large with development of civilization, agriculture, and industry. It all started with movement. It didn't start with sitting, right? It's all started with movement. So all these advancements of technology in societal structures, especially in the more affluent Western societies, has led to an overwhelming decrease in the amount of variety of movement that most humans need to perform on a daily basis. So it's kind of interesting. We used movement to create all these great advancements in today's society, but it's all led to less movement. So historically, humans needed to move almost constantly throughout the day in order to find or prepare food, build shelter, escape predators, protect or connect with their tribe. So these days, most of us have the ability to tap a few buttons on our phone screens in a safe, walled, air-conditioned house. Food can arrive at our doorsteps, delivered by a complete stranger. And that's what our society is now. We just don't need to move. I can communicate with whoever I want while sitting. I don't need to get out. I remember as a kid, if I wanted to find a friend, it was jump on your bike and go find them, right? There wasn't any cell phones that you can just text, hey, where are you? Oh, I'm sitting at home. Cool, I'm sitting at home. Let's just have a 2-hour text message conversation, right? It was get out and find your friends if you wanted to go do something, right? So the big problem right now with all this is our body and our planet is suffering. Every single system in our body relies on frequent, variable movement to function optimally. Without it, our bodies will gradually become more and more dysfunctional and more diseased. Our muscles will weaken, our joints will ache, our arteries will stiffen, our immune system will decrease, our brain will degenerate. We become less energetic, less social, less joyful. We start to feel fragile, anxious, depressed. We get hurt easily. Physically, mentally, and spiritually, we'll get hurt easier. And then our planet hurts too, right? So outsourcing our own movement to technology or other animals takes a massive toll on the earth. Fossil fuels, monocultural farming, deforestation, easy for you to say, deforestation, chemical pollutants, overpopulation, and current mass extinction events are just some of the effects we are experiencing. We view ourselves as somehow separate from nature, or even better, smarter and more advanced than nature. But in reality, that we are not separate. We are part of nature. We are part of this planet. We inhabit it. And there are all these new forms of understanding of how connecting to the earth actually can decrease inflammation in the body. There's something called earthing, which essentially is just being in nature with your feet, unrestricted by shoes, and feeling the ground, below you, can actually decrease anxiety and decrease uh, inflammation. There's something called forest bathing that the Japanese do regularly. Just going 20 minutes into the forest and just looking at what nature has will drop anxiety and stress levels. So as much as we think, we're, dominating this world and we can do whatever we want, we're starting to remove ourselves from who we are, which is part of nature. So what can we do about such a massive and complex problem? Well, first, it starts with ourselves and reconnecting with movement. Reconnecting with movement in our own lives, developing on our own strength, mobility, balance, and skills, just working on them, exploring ways to become more mindful, exploring the way to become more useful and playful with our movement, experiencing the struggles and the overcoming the obstacles that is part of being a human, celebrating the wins, and most importantly, enjoying the journey that we're going through. When we do this, we can start to directly and indirectly influence the people around us in a positive way. As health professionals or health advocates, we are all part of a potential global collective that we can really help change the way movement culture is across the world and start creating movement as something that we do regularly. Now, when it comes to movement, the most inspiring thing I have really heard about when it comes to movement is what's called load profile. And essentially what load profile is something that we are lacking, because load profile is an important part of movement in the fact that different loads placed upon the body are going to strengthen us and make our body stronger, make our body better. Right now, the majority of society has one load profile, and that's sitting. It's one load profile, and that's sitting. And sitting is a load profile. All right, because what we're doing is we are flexing at the hips, we are rounding our shoulders, and we are putting our elbows in a flexed position. And a lot of people put their calves in a plantar flex position when they sit. And what's happening is our load profile is just that. It's plantar flexion of the ankles, it's flexion of the knee, it's flexion of the hip, it's rounding of the shoulders, and it's flexion of the elbow. And we just sit in these flexed positions, and that is a load profile. And what happens if you sit in that position long enough, the muscles will adapt to it, because our whole body is a adaptable machine. And when we put it in certain positions, it adapts to it. That's why I started Mobility Monday for us, is to put you guys through some different load profiles so you can understand that if you do something regularly and you load the body differently, you'll see improvements. Now, why do I have a picture of 2 orca whales up here with load profile? Well, this is the best way of explaining load profile, because there is a floppy fin theory with orca whales. And what you'll see is the whale with the floppy fin is a whale that's in captivity. And the whale with the strong, upright looking fin is a wild orca in the ocean. So why do they have 2 different fins? Why don't they both look the same? Shouldn't the floppy fin be up And the answer is no, because of load profile. So what happens is, if you look at the fin of an orca whale, it's the the anatomy of it is very similar to ligaments and tendons and muscles in the human body, and the fact that it's collagen fibers, and it's very reactive, just like our muscles and our bones and our ligaments and our tendons. So, in order for a orca whale's fin to be upright, strong, look good, is it needs different loads. And what those loads are by swimming down, certain depths of the water, which will put stress and pressure on it. And it will make that fin have to adapt to the different pressures that it's being put on it in the ocean. An orca in captivity only has a certain depth that they can swim down to, and it's not deep enough in order to get that varying pressure that their fin needs. So what happens over time, it adapts by becoming weak. It adapts by flopping over because it's not getting the stimulus it needs in order to be upright and strong. So the floppy fin theory is essentially what happens when we don't put enough load on our body. Now, in my mind, human body has really two floppy fins that are happening from sitting too much. And another, not just sitting, but another aspect. So first off, the first floppy fin that I believe humans have is what's called kyphosis. And if you don't know what kyphosis is, it's just when the spine, the upper part of the thoracic and the cervical vertebrae start hunching over. It's essentially hunchback. And if you look at yourself in the mirror right now, you take a profile shot of you sitting down, it's probably, you're probably hunched over. You're not probably up straight, next, over top of one another, spine in line, because you're sitting. And the natural thing to do when you sit is hunch over, right? So just by sitting too much, we're going to get that one floppy fin, which is we're going to have this hunched back, right? Our muscles and our back are getting weak from not having the appropriate load placed upon them. The other floppy fin I believe we have is our feet. Quick question here that you can answer to yourselves is, how many of you wear shoes regularly? If you wear shoes regularly, then what you're actually doing is creating a floppy fin in your feet, because shoes provide support and structure, unnatural structure, to the feet. And what happens is your feet adapt to it. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of problems that people have start at their feet. And a lot of those problems start with shoes. So we have two floppy fins that are happening because we're not putting appropriate load onto our feet. Kyphosis is one, and then just our feet becoming misshaped because of our shoes and not putting the right type of stress and load on our feet. So if we look at sitting, well, bottom line is we're going to sit throughout the day. It's natural. It's natural to sit. It's natural to sit and rest. But really, there isn't any requirement that says you need to sit in a chair. One of the coolest research studies that I've seen was done by an anthropologist named Gordon Hughes. And he compiled essentially a visual list of how people take rests all over the world. And this picture here is a visual adaptation of the research. These are all different ways people sit or rest. So you can see there's a variety of ways that you can sit and rest. But if you've sat in a chair for a long period of time, then a lot of these positions are going to be hard to get into because of the load profile is so different. And one thing I try to do is when I'm working, I work on the floor. I have a little floor desk and I work on the floor because I know when I'm on the floor, I'm going to get into a different position. Probably, if I'm working an hour, I'm probably going to get into a different position at least 60 times. Each minute, I'll probably shift position because these positions, they make you uncomfortable. They might be a resting position, but they're going to stress the muscle differently. And so you're going to have to shift. And that's good because that's almost like doing a little bit of mobility work while you're working. So resting and moving on the ground, it creates an environmental input for the brain to solve basic yet important stability and postural problems. These fundamental activation patterns can really create micronutrients that are the prerequisites to then implement into more complex macro skills. So there is really over 100 ancestral ground resting positions out there. And they all help develop these micronutrients that will contribute to competency during macro skills of squatting, standing, walking, running, climbing, balancing. Even jumping, you can throw in there too. Right? Even performance skills, I would say that these different sitting positions would help with. So what we want to do is, again, go back to the environment. Create an environment at home that makes it convenient to adopt resting positions on the ground instead of in a chair and a couch. Right? And that is just also a tremendous way to reconnect with nature's cure for self-imposed problems that come from sedentary living. And that's one thing we need to understand as future health professionals, health advocates, kinesiologists, is these bodies that we have been given were meant to move. And my eyes were really open to movement when I had kids, because kids are the most primal creatures in human species that we can really see, because they're exploring their environment in their world in a completely different way than we are. And to watch them learn how to roll over, to learn how to crawl, to learn how to stand, to learn how to walk, to learn how to run, to learn how to jump, is a tremendous reminder of what we should be doing. We've already gone through those learning aspects of life, but for some reason we get to this certain point and it's just, we sit. And it probably starts at school, because when we're in elementary school, we are forced to sit. And I have a big problem with that. We should not be forced to sit. We should be given environments where we're going to move. All right? And if you ever take a class with me in person, I'm getting very, very close to removing the tables and chairs from my classroom and having you, or providing a safe area for you to sit on the floor and work. Because I think that's way more important than sitting in a chair. And I feel bad. I now feel bad making students sit for 2 hours at a time. I understand it's probably necessary. And if you've been sitting for the last however many minutes this lecture has been so far, feel free to hit the pause button, get up, and have a movement vitamin. Because I don't want you to sit for the entire time listening to this lecture. Right? Move around, be on the floor, get in some different positions, work on some mobility while you watch it. I am right now. I've moved position probably 10 times since starting this lecture, because I'm on the ground recording it. I'm not on a chair. Very rarely will you see me on a chair. So I really like the movement nutrition. I really like that concept of movement nutrition. Because movement essentially is nutrition for our bodies. And the loads we experience in our life, both internal and external sources, directly and indirectly influence the structure and function of our cells, as well as our tissues and our organs, so our entire body. Obvious examples are things like bone density and muscle mass. No matter how well you eat or how many mineral or protein supplements you consume, if you don't move, then your bones will weaken and your muscles will shrink. That is a fact. I don't need to put up research studies that show that. That is the bottom line. So I have a picture of an astronaut up here because astronauts really display that better than anyone. And it can easily be seen in studies done on astronauts or bedridden patients, because astronauts have no gravity against them. Bedridden patients essentially are not moving. So it makes logical sense, but a similar relationship also exists with movement and essentially every system in our body. Cardiovascular, respiratory, endocrine, immune, neurological, they all rely on frequent, variable movements in order to function optimally. So when an astronaut gets in space, one thing they need to do is they need to move. They need to figure out how to move. So space stations will have specific gyms so they can try to stress their body while in zero gravity. So just like food, movement is a vital stimulus for changes in our gene expression at the cellular level. And just as with food, our body needs the right quantity, quality, and variety of movement nutrients in order to function optimally in the long term. In the natural context, this would be provided by all the movements we would need to do in order to survive. Unfortunately, our modern environment and lifestyle drastically has reduced our movement options. Things like conventional footwear, as I've mentioned, and flat, level, ground-restricted movements at feet and ankles. Chairs restrict movement in the whole body by allowing us to be in sedentary positions for a long period of time. We obviously no longer need to hunt or gather food. We no longer have predators that we need to escape from in our daily lives. Almost our entire environment and lifestyle are set up for sedentarism. Even many of our designated exercise fitness areas actually still promote sedentarism in a subtle way. So our entire population of people are essentially starving for movement. And we are seeing the effects in the stats and the research around chronic pain, falls as we get older, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and mental health problems. So when our body needs nutrients, it gives us an important signal. Hunger. When we need food, we have a natural signal of hunger. It may start off as a slight feeling of emptiness or a little grumble, but the longer we go without food, the more intense the feeling can become. We could go days, weeks without food, and you may then start to feel lethargia, nausea, stomach cramps, and pains. On the other hand, if we eat an enormous meal and continue to shove down as much food as we could, then our body would also give us signals indicating that we've eaten too much. Bloating, discomfort, cramps, pain, nausea. If you had enough calories, but not enough micronutrients, like eating 20 chocolate bars a day as an extreme example, then you would expect to also end up with symptoms that are related to deficiency in those nutrients. These are all natural reactions of the body to lack of food over an extended period of time, or a sudden influx of huge amounts of foods in a short period of time. Okay, the glucose example I gave you, we all probably have felt the sugar highs and the sugar lows. And when you eat healthy, when you eat, food that your body needs more of, and then you put sugar in it and your glucose level spikes and drops, you feel it even more. So we wouldn't see these body signals as a nuisance or something we need to fight with pain medication or tummy massages. Most people would acknowledge it for what it was. I just haven't eaten enough, or I ate way too much. Either way, it's a learning experience and an opportunity for you to change the way you feed your body so that you can make it feel good more of the time. When our body is lacking movement nutrients, either quantity, quality, or variety, it also starts to give us signals. Those signals are stiffness, weakness, aches, lethargy. And then it eventually becomes more and more intense, chronic pain, depression. On the other hand, you may have a short period of too much movement or a load that our body was not prepared for, like going for a 10K run first thing after 3 years off of running. You would expect some symptoms to arise afterwards and wouldn't be surprised if you had to take a break from movement, at least some types of movement, for some days just to recover from that. Now imagine as well someone who sits in a chair all day for work and then goes for a run in the afternoon to get their daily exercise. This would be the equivalent of eating 5 carrots a day every day as their only nutrition. Carrots are great, but without a range of other foods, they guarantee end up deficient in something. So it's the same thing with exercise. If running is your only form of exercise, it's something, and something is better than nothing, but it's not going to lead to a balanced body. So sometimes there's more complexity behind the signals than simply a movement nutrition issue. Various psychological factors that can strongly influence people's perception of pain and other musculoskeletal symptoms. Either way, we have to listen to these signals in order to learn and grow from them. Sometimes we need help understanding them and knowing how to respond to them. Mostly we can do this ourselves in our daily lives. So just some simple actions that you can get started when it comes to symptoms and understanding symptoms. So first thing you can do, pressed the wrong button there. First thing you can do is make a list of any current musculoskeletal symptoms that you have. So things like foot pain, hip stiffness, tight neck muscles, chronic or reoccurring back injuries, tendinitis, whether it's patella, Achilles, carpal tunnel. Just do you have any current musculoskeletal symptoms? And then after, you can list out what kind of movements you currently do on a daily basis and how much time you spend moving. For example, how much running or walking do you do? How much time do you go into the gym? How much time do you do yoga or mobility work, or how much do you sit on the floor? Then the third step is you reflect on what your movement nutrient profile looks like for your whole body for each area: feet, ankles, knees, hips, spine, shoulders, arms. And think about how any current symptom could be related. And then the fourth step is you list out ideas of how to start improving your movement nutrient profile. So example, walking to work or school or shops or markets. Parking further away is walking more. Sitting on the floor during work time or meal times. Using a sit-to-stand desk at work or just a stand desk at work. Going barefoot more. Learning a new skill, right? And those are ways of increasing your movement and your movement nutrition. And then that will start helping us with what I call natural movement. So the vast majority of our evolution as humans, we really have never had the option of being sedentary. We had to move frequently if we wanted to survive in the natural environment. As a species, we developed um, a huge repertoire of fundamental movement patterns that allowed us to do this. Things like crawling, squatting, walking, running, jumping, carrying, climbing, throwing, and fighting. These movements all provided us with ideal, nutritious movement diets that kept our bodies strong, mobile, and resilient for as long as we lived. Over time, that need for frequent use of gross movement patterns gradually decreased as the demand for fine motor skills gradually increased. The development and use of technology became an even more important survival and social trait than the ability to move with power, speed, and skill through our environment. The more advanced the technology, the less we had to use our own time and energy into achieving a particular result. To the point now that the vast majority of us are sedentary for the majority of the day. This is an ideal situation for the body in terms of short-term survival. However, the fact we no longer need these movements to survive does not mean that our body no longer needs to be healthy in the long term. Without the input of movement and load, our body breaks down and becomes weak, stiff, and painful. Without the input of natural movements like crawling, squatting, walking, running, climbing, our bodies become unbalanced and vulnerable to injuries and falls. We need the frequent use of these different patterns to keep our joints mobile and our muscles strong. Learning to move naturally not only gives us a wide spectrum of key movement nutrients, it also prepares our body for unexpected or emergency situations in our daily life. The ability to run, sprint, jump, throw, lift, climb, balance, swim could literally make the difference between life and death for ourselves or our loved ones in extreme circumstances. In these situations, our bodies go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and we fall to the level of our training. If our body is already practiced in these skills, we are unlikely to be able to use them effectively or without injury. So these days, natural movement is actually a set of movement patterns and skills that we must learn and practice if we want to minimize injury, pain, or disease throughout our life. We can use the common forms of natural movement as a screening tool for our bodies to see where we might be missing capacity of skill. We can use various methods to increase our ability to do these movements, and we can explore them in a playful way in urban and natural environments. They can be a source of great utility and great enjoyment. Erwin LaCour has done an admirable job of presenting a definition in his book, The Practice of Natural Movement, which also includes a progressive approach to learning these movements and skills. So he proposes the following characteristics of natural movement. Evolutionary. Natural movement stems from the way our species has adapted to life in nature since the dawn of mankind. Instinctual. We start developing fundamental natural movement patterns as infants without needing instruction. Universal. Natural movement is everyone's birthright, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or age. Practical. The primary purpose of natural movement is to be useful at ensuring basic physiological needs. Vital. Natural movement supports survival in life-threatening circumstances and ultimately serves biological fitness. 6. Unspecialized. Natural movement skills are interrelated and work symbolically. Adaptable. Natural movement adjusts to the diverse contexts, contextual variables, and demands of the real world. Environmental. Natural movement originally developed as adapted behavior for the diverse natural environment in which early humans lived. Progressive. Natural movement capacity is developed and can be maintained over time. Efficient. Natural movement capacity is developed and should be maintained over time. Mindful. Attention ensures efficiency in natural movement. And finally, cooperative. Humans use natural movements primarily for the benefits of group or community they belong to. He also proposes the following principles for efficient movement: breathing, position, tension relaxation, sequence and timing, local positional control. And the following skill patterns as being crucial to humans: ground moving, like laying, rolling, crawling, sitting, kneeling, getting up. Balance movements, single leg stance, tandem walks. I'm getting to the point now where I believe, you can incorporate upper body single arm handstand. Could be a balance movement if you're strong enough. Gait movements, walking, running, sprinting. Airborne movements, jumping and landing. Climbing movements, hanging, scaling, and traversing. And manipulation movements, lifting, carrying, throwing. These are all movements that we should be able to perform. And they're all movements, if you watch kids play, things that they do regularly. But for some reason, it stops. So ideally, a functional human adult would have the ability to perform all those movements effectively. But the reality is that the majority of humans today simply cannot due to the lack of skill, conditioning, or both. Our modern environment and lifestyle simply doesn't promote the use of these movements, and our body tends to do what it does best: conserve energy. The thought of fitting all into our busy lives can be overwhelming, and it's hard to know where to start. But the reality is, you can start small. Figure out what skill, what movement you're not sufficient in, and try and work on it. Right? One thing that I read a research article, and it was one of the most interesting research articles I've read in a long time. And it looked at the difference between rotator cuff muscles in primates. So humans, apes, monkeys, all primates. And what the research found was the human rotator cuff muscle has actually changed in structure over the evolutionary time. And our rotator cuff is completely different than our primate relatives. And I believe that's because we've completely eliminated climbing and hanging and swinging from our natural movement. I mean, when's the last time you just went and hung on something and swung and hung on one arm? I bet you most of you probably can't even hang with one arm right now. Right? We've lost our natural abilities, our natural movements. And one thing I'm actually incorporated more on in my daily movement practice is hanging and swinging and trying to hang on one arm, because a lot of shoulder injuries are caused by the rotator cuff muscle not being strong enough. And everyone thinks that, by doing external internal rotation exercises is going to strengthen our rotator cuff because the name of the rotator cuff is rotator. But in reality, our rotator cuff does way more than just rotation. And the hanging and swinging plays a big role. And you can get stronger shoulders just by hanging and swinging. That's why kids, they love hanging, they love swinging, and they have the strongest shoulders. And kids should be continuing to do that, continuing to hang and swing. Always get them to do that, along with all movements, ground movements too. It's the last time you rolled or crawled. But you know what? There's actually I've actually seen some research that shows crawling daily can actually enhance brain function because it links movement and motor learning with the brain that we don't do enough. And it's one thing a lot of people do with, when it comes to stroke victims, stroke patients. After they've had a stroke and their brain isn't working, they go through ground movements to start them off. They basically have to reteach them how to move again. And that's almost what we have to do, even if we haven't had a stroke, if we've just been sitting too much, too sedentary. We have to relearn all these natural movements, to relearn ground movements, bouncing movements, gait movements, airborne movements, climbing movements, manipulation movements. Right? Find out what you're good at. So movement practice is key. All right. So what we need to do is make sure that we move and we practice more. It's well understood that sedentarism is a major cause of physical and mental pain and disease in humans, and that our modern environment greatly restricts our movement in many ways. So to make up for this lack of natural movements, humans invented exercise and created certain areas or facilities that promote movement. So gyms, rehab centers, sporting fields, playgrounds. So exercise really can be defined as activity that requires physical effort, carried out to sustain or improve health and fitness. Common exercise activities include things like running, swimming, cycling, resistance training, boot camp style high intensity workouts. The majority of people know that they should be exercising or working out more, but they view it as undesirable chore that needs a lot of discipline to keep up with in order to get or stay in shape. This tends to result in people trying to get as much work in as possible in a short amount of time without giving much thought as to how they're moving or what else they're doing throughout the day to prepare their bodies for this type of load. People also tend to stick to one type of exercise. Example, running, lifting weights, high intensity interval training, and avoid movements that they don't have experience or confidence in. Unfortunately, this can very easily lead to things like overtraining and pain injuries due to imbalances in the quality, quantity, and variability of movement nutrients. A more intelligent and sustainable approach to exercise is to develop a movement practice. This means you are focusing on learning and mastering movement skills rather than simply working muscles. Taking a skill-based approach means you are forced to work on the efficiency and technique, which is the quality of movement, in order to progress from basic to advanced skills. This is both more engaging and more rewarding as the mind and body thrive in this type of gradual progression. This is especially true if the skill you are learning are relevant or enjoyable to you in some way, like getting back into an activity you used to do when you were growing up or something you've always wanted to try but never got around to. Some common examples would be surfing, paddleboarding, skating, martial arts, hand balancing, acrobatics, all great ways to start playing around with. But you could also turn your usual exercise into a practice by simply focusing on the skill component of the activity you're doing. Running, lifting, swimming are all complex technical skills that can be developed with the right guidance and feedback. You don't have to be working like you're aiming for the next Olympics, but there is an immense value in getting some coaching, especially in the early phases. Once you build confidence in the key skills, you can quickly become more independent with your training and progression. Some characteristics to consider when developing a movement practice: mindfulness. Am I learning more about my own capacity, limitations, and goals by practicing this? Am I tuning into the way I'm moving in order to improve my skills and abilities? Usefulness is another characteristic. Is this making me more useful or a valuable member of my community in some way? Am I better able to respond to varied and unexpected demands in my daily life throughout this practice? Another characteristic is playfulness. Am I able to explore this movement in unstructured and creative ways? Am I getting some kind of fun or enjoyment out of this? Every session doesn't always need to tick all these boxes off, but these questions can help you direct you to a certain discipline or approaches. For example, mindfulness. Well, that can lead to breath work, walking meditation, yoga, hand balancing, strength kinetic stretching. Characteristic of useful. Well, it could be natural movements like running, lifting, climbing. martial arts, parkour, strength training. Playful could be something like surfing, skating, skiing, snowboarding, dancing, team sports. All ways to start enjoying and increasing your movement practice. I try to do all sorts of movement practice every day. I always try and do something. When I'm working, when I'm folding laundry, I'll go into a squat. And I fold laundry in a squat because it helps me maintain my range of motion. And I play around with mobility work all the time, trying to figure out a natural movement pattern that I can use in mobility work. Right? So movement practice is important, and we have to realize that, movement practice, it doesn't have to be exercise. If you enjoy exercise and that's part of your movement pattern practice, then that's fantastic. But for some people, they just don't want to go to the gym. They just don't want to go for a run. So you need to help them explore other ways to enjoy movement practice. One way is through play. Getting people to play is a way to increase movement. And, many people are good at identifying play when they see it. Kids on the playground laughing, moving, right? Puppies wrestling each other. That's all play. But most adults struggle to understand the importance of play and how it is very different than work. Todd Hargrove does a great job in his book with movement outlining ways that play is different than work, which can help us create a clearer picture when defining play. So play is really, it's intrinsically motivating. Put simply, playful activities are done for their intrinsic pleasure and not for external reward or purpose. We do them because the act of play in itself is rewarding. Experts on animal behavior consider an activity to be play if it doesn't serve as a survival or reproductive purpose. So play is also not about doing things that are silly, immature, or trivial. It's about getting fully absorbed in an activity that is intrinsically motivating. It is an end to itself and not a means to an end. The opposite side of the spectrum for play is work or drudgery. Activities that we dislike doing that require willpower and conscious control to complete, which typically hold an intrinsic benefit. Many times, this is money or physical appearance. Play involves minimal stress. In the natural world, play never compromises recovery or movement health. Animals or babies that aren't feeling well or are under stress will typically stop playing. Adults might love to run, do CrossFit, or lift weights, but when they're done through pain, these movements are done through pain. It then becomes considered work and no longer resembles the play. Play is exploration. When a baby is playing, there's no directions or guidelines telling them what to do, and it inherently involves creative exploration. Exploring movement without strictly defined goal allows for trial and error without constraint in exploration itself, if enjoyable instead of simply being means to an end. Play is creative in a world where fitness has become regimented, programmed activity. We have lost the creative element for our movement. Play is creative and unstructured. It provides the freedom to move in novel ways to solve a problem or to react to a partner. Play removes the pressure of needing to obtain a goal in doing this can unleash new patterns of activation in our brain and really enhance creativity. Play is also tinkering. Tinkering means trying to solve a problem through trial and error by fiddling around with variables in semi-random manner. This constraints to a work strategy that relies on precise planning and by nature will limit creativity. We often apply a tinkering mindset when it comes to pain. If your back hurts when deadlifting, you will sometimes, even subconsciously, play around slightly with your posture or technique until you find one that eliminates the pain or it feels more efficient. The modern day fitness instructor yelling out precise cues on exactly how you must move had disempowered the individual to tinker, to be creative with their movement. And I have a great problem with that as a strength and conditioning coach. One thing I notice with athletes is always they do a set and then they look at you and they're like, well, is that okay? And it's just, they seem to have completely lost the empowerment of figuring out if it's okay for themselves. And yes, it's my job to tell them if it's okay. But at the same time, I want them to know if it's okay. I want them to feel the technique and feel the movement, not rely on me. And so a lot of times when I'm working with athletes and they say to me, "Well, was that a good set?" I'll ask the question. You tell me. Was it a good set? How did you feel? What did you feel? Where did your legs feel during the set? What did your arms feel like during the set? I'll try and get them to get back into empowerment. I think that's, this whole philosophy of play, I think, can go back to the athletic side of things as well and help empower athletes by really problem solving and figuring out movements themselves again. Play involves risk, and this is a big thing, and this is one that a lot of parents have a problem with. And there's a book called Anti-Fragile, and it talks about how resiliency really is the midpoint. It shouldn't be, resiliency isn't what we should be trying to obtain in life. And I use that towards movement now. And so the author created this anti-fragile, which is obviously the opposite of fragile. And so many people in the training realm and childhood play, they use that term resiliency. But really what we should be doing is trying to create anti-fragile kids. And we do that through play with the understanding of risk. Because play is often used to explore limits. And because of this, it could result in certain risk. So whether it's a puppy's wrestling or a child figuring out how fast they can run, learning where lines are by crossing them can sometimes result in injury, but sometimes it's a necessary element of improvement and becoming anti-fragile over resilient. So injury is the way we learn our limits, and for kids, the memory of an injury is what informs the level of risk they're willing to accept in the future. As parents, what you need to do is make sure that they are exploring the movement but not taking too big of risks. Right? So for example, kids need to understand that there is danger when they run down the hill as fast as they can. They can pick up a lot of speed, and if they trip, they can seriously hurt themselves. So by allowing them to do that, you need to have a little bit of control over it, because you don't want them to experience the severe pain that running down a hill as fast as you can could result in. Right? But you need them to be able to figure out on their own somehow. Right? So if you see them running down the hill on the road, maybe say, okay, let's not do that on the road. If they're running down the hill on a grassy hill, then you could probably let them explore that movement a little bit, because the fall will hurt, but probably not as bad as if you fall on the cement. So when it comes to fear, comes to risk, there's fear that eventually can develop. And fear is the enemy of movement freedom. And by participating in play that involves risk, we learn to master fear and gain confidence in movement after successfully handling a risky situation. This sense of self-efficacy is protective against chronic pain and disability. And it's something many people today are missing by forgetting how to play and tinkering with their body at varying levels of risk. Exposing yourself to regular doses of risky situations can create immunity against the disease of anxiety. So, with parents today not giving children the freedom to explore risk by climbing trees, going out on their own with friends, or disapproving of roughhousing, this could be a reason that kids today are more fragile and they're not turning into anti-fragile kids. And there's actually research that is showing that teenagers right now are more susceptible to anxiety and stress because of how they were not exposed to playful risk factors as kids. So as much as we are thinking we're protecting our kids from bodily harm and by coddling them and not allowing them to do things like climbing trees and exploring movements in a somewhat risky way, we actually can cause anxiety later on from that. So what we want to do is we want to become a mover. That should be our goal. We don't want to be a sitter, we want to be a mover. And we want to live a movement-centric lifestyle. So many people who exercise daily consider themselves as an active person. Or, as I like to call them, a mover. Whether you are a mover or a sitter really boils down to some simple arithmetic. Do you spend more of your waking hours moving or sitting? If the majority is spent moving, i.e. not in a static position and on a chair, then you are a mover or an active person. If the majority is spent sitting, then you are a sitter, a sedentary person. This means that if you sit for 8 hours a day, but exercise for 2, you could still be considered a sedentary person. But if you never step foot in the gym to exercise, but spend your entire day on the move, you are an active person or a mover. So it's an important distinction and something many people don't take into account. Help people switch from being a sitter to a mover, and they will achieve massive position changes in global health. So we want to live this movement-centric lifestyle. All right, so we talked about physically active lifestyle. I prefer the term movement-centric lifestyle. So if we're living a movement-centric lifestyle in a modern urban environment, it means we have to be movement opportunists. It also means making efforts to engineer your physical environment to promote movement and de-insensitize sedentary behavior. It means living a lifestyle that is closer to our biological norm, yet further from the current cultural norm. It means sacrificing comfort and convenience to create chances to express your physicality. A movement-centric lifestyle prepares you for life and ensures that your physical and mental function remain optimal for a lifetime. So as health advocates, it's our role to inspire people to understand the benefits of living a movement-centric lifestyle and to help them discover opportunities for movement every day that didn't know existed. So there's really a few parts of the body that we want to focus on when it comes to movement and helping movement, because these are the parts that are creating a lot of problems. And the first one I want to look at is your foot or your feet. So if you look at your feet, each foot contains 33 joints. That might not mean much, but consider that joints, which are points where two different bones meet and articulate, are adapted for the purpose of movement. So right off the bat, your feet have 32 joints, 33 points of movement. You have an elbow joint as well. So you can feed yourself and throw things, but don't need a joint in the middle of your forearm because movement isn't required there. So we have all these joints in our feet. We have 33 joints in each foot. What does that tell you? To me, it tells me that feet are designed to be capable of immense amount of motion. And that is the foundation of our body. Our feet must be both adaptable and strong. Because what happens is We have to adapt to uneven ground by deforming them in many different planes. And that's why we have so many different joints. But at the same time, it also must become a rigid lever so that you have something to push off when you're walking, running, jumping, whatever you're doing. So they do both of these functions with every step. Think about that for a second. Every step you take, your foot should be deforming in different planes, but at the same time being a rigid lever for movement. So the foot is an amazing part of the body that we neglect. And we neglect it with modern footwear. Take a look at your shoes. With most modern footwear, it's stiff and prevents optimal motion for these 33 joints. So it's no wonder why we lose mobility in our feet and our ankle or our hip. Because our feet is a big element in reclaiming strong, anti-fragile, optimally functioning feet and body. So we need to be able to try and restore the motion to 33 joints, because our shoes that we're wearing right now restricts the motion in those 33 joints. So what's the most effective method? Barefoot locomotion and switching to flexible, functional footwear. Simple stuff, powerful effects. If we look at our ankle, a lot of people have terrible ankle mobility. I got you guys to do this exact mobility test. How many of you struggled with it? How many of you were not able to get your knee past your medial malleolus? So poor ankle mobility is an epidemic in today's age. And what we're starting to see is locked up ankles. And locked up ankles creates huge problems upstream in the body when it comes to movement. Ankles show up in almost every movement pattern done on the feet. Walking, squatting, lunging, going upstairs. And that's just a few. You can go into performance as well. Jumping, bounding, skipping. Right? They all require optimal ankle mobility in order to avoid compensation from other joints. Why is ankle mobility such a big problem? Well, here's a few things right off the bat. Shoes that have elevated heel, those are normal now. And when we spend all day in an elevated heel, we're moving essentially with our heels up and our toes slightly pointed. It completely shifts the brain's perception and creates tension in the other direction, which is dorsiflexion. One of the effects of overdosing on sitting in chairs is that we lose the ability to extend our hips. Losing hip extension reduces the propulsion we get from the glutes. Positional inhibition, not weakness. And the calf is an area that also picks up the load. So we get tight calves, tight ankles. Another thing we do is we simply don't spend enough time exploring the full range of our ankle mobility. And then our body just adapts accordingly by reducing the range available to us. So what's the solution? Restoring ankle mobility. Switching to flat shoes. Restore mobility, especially in extension, and stability at the hips. Reset calf tissue tension and spend time daily doing ankle mobility range of motion. And the squat is a great position to do this. Hips. Well, hips really are the primary engine of the human body when it comes to upright movement and locomotion. They are these two large ball and socket joints, and they've been adapted over thousands of years to stabilize the body with upright walking and provide significant force production from a group of surrounding muscles, specifically the glutes. When it comes to hip mobility, the term use it or lose it applies in a big way. We accumulate large amounts of time throughout our lives in the position of hip flexion, neutral rotation, and adduction, aka sitting in a chair. The body adapts accordingly and will then shrink the available mobility at the hip joint to reflect the fact that the large ranges of motion are no longer needed, and we get stiff and we can't do things like squats. When the hip joint gets stiff, we begin to rely on areas above and below, low back and knee. That plays a role and can no longer be filled by the hip. This relationship of regional independence is a big culprit for the epidemic of low back pain and seemingly normal quad dominance that modern humans have acquired in movement. So what we want to do is look at what's called protect, correct, develop framework. So before focusing on mobilizing our tight hip joints back to the natural state, a conversation needs to be had about what is eliminating the mobility, what's causing the restrictions. So we need to spread awareness about the harmful effects of prolonged chair sitting and helping people develop strategies to gradually replace time spent sitting in a chair and time spent moving on a regular, varying position. That's the first step. So one strategy to reduce sitting is really by incorporating more mobility. So once we have that strategy in reducing sitting and it's underway, it's then time to improve range of motion available with our specific mobility work and updates to the software along the way. So movements that we need to be better at, we need to be able to do. And one thing, there's a couple movements that we aren't really very good at anymore. And I noticed this when I teach the 1120 course, which is more of the exercise prescription. And one of the movements we don't do very well anymore is the hinge. And being able to hinge essentially means being able to shift weight into your hip joint without compensation at the spine or knees. So we teach variations of the hinge in 3303 and 1120. And what we want to make sure we do is teach people how to do it properly, teach them as an essential movement, so we can work on mastering the hinge and almost use it as like a software update for people. And they can apply that software update in creating space in the hip joint. So the hinge is a fundamental movement. It's fundamental first movement, especially when we're doing things like the squat or a deadlift. So we need to make sure we master it. But as our hips get tight and underused, they get put on the sideline and no longer available as the primary option for force production. The next joint in line in this case is the knee. So the brain is smart. When one option is removed, it simply finds a way to adapt, and the way it adapts when we develop chairitis at the hip is to enlist the knee as the primary joint, and that's when we become quad dominant. So we start using our knees more and more until one day we hear some grinding or they start to hurt. And we wonder why. Is this just normal aging? Well, it's not. It's because we don't use our hips enough, and our body compensates by using our knee as our prime mover. Now, this is bad when it comes to sports, because if you're not using your hips in those powerful movements and your knee is the prime mover, that is going to increase your risk of knee injuries, substantial knee injuries like ligament tears. So the hinge is a fundamental movement, and it's one we need to get better at. The squat is another fundamental movement that one of the first mobility exercises I got you guys to do is a squat, and see how far you can get into the squat with your feet together. And honestly, the fitness industry has ruined our relationship with the squat. We think of squats as something that is done repetitively and under a barbell to a specific depth without our knees coming in front of our feet to help guide leg and glute muscles. The squat can surely be used as an exercise to build lower body strength, but it's much more than that. And it's been changed so much because of the way, the fitness industry looks at. It's always, knee over your toes, but in reality, your knee is fine to go over your toes if you're moving properly. The squat was, and really should be this way, a defaulting resting position for humans. You want to take a break from gravity? Pop into a squat and you can take a break while being supported by the bony and soft tissue of the body. Want to prepare food? Want to eat? Want to read? Well, the squat can be done in order to do that. The squat was the way we did most of our resting until the chair was invented. And then as soon as the squat position became optional, humans then stopped doing it. And we started seeing a decline in the function of hips and core. So we need to rescue the squat. We need to bring awareness that there's a value of the squat, especially as a resting position. So if we can get back to squatting regularly, we are going to immensely improve the function of our body. A resting squat position is a powerful tool because it can also act as a screen for optimal mobility at the hips, knee, and ankle. But also, it's being in possession of an important software need to get into position. Teach people why the squat is important, provide them guidance on working to reclaim the resting squat position, and inspire them to work on it every day, and you'll make humongous changes in their life. The picture I have of myself up here doing squat, this is one of the main functional movement screen tests, and it's just an overhead deep squat. And what position I'm in here is what you want to be able to do when you get into a squat with something pressed over your head. You want your thoracic and lumbar spine to be relatively in line. You want your hips to be below your knees. You want your knees just over your toes. You want your ankles dorsiflexed. That's how you should squat. And this deep squat position is just a marvelous screening technique. So what we want to do is work on developmental movement. So as babies, we develop from helpless, immobile organisms into a mobile creature capable of rolling, crawling, squatting, and walking within the first 2 years of life. We do this without any coaching or cueing and along a predictable pathway of movement milestones. These developmental movement patterns provide a powerful reference point when looking to reconnect with natural movement and can help with providing guidance on optimal pathway to reclaim efficient movement in your later years of life. As adults, we typically accumulate years and decades of little movement and overcompensations of specific status positions. The effect of this lack of movement is that our movement patterns gradually atrophy and compensations begin to be layered on. Our adaptability, in this case, is detrimental. And many people don't notice any indicators or symptoms from these compensations until the body simply cannot continue and start sending signals of change in form of pain. Working through fundamental movement patterns like rolling, crawling, and squatting, which form the building blocks for more complex patterns like walking, running, and moving without load, can help detect deficiencies and compensations before they become symptoms. So by going on the floor, we reduce the postural demands and the number of moving parts compared to standing. And this can help reduce pain or improve movement capacity. In someone that has developed imbalances, this movement capacity is glaring and the lack of it. So what we want to do is work on sitting less, standing in one place less, and getting on the floor and moving more. And people always ask me about standing desks, and they say, oh, I went from a sitting desk and a standing desk. And I always say that's great, awesome, because standing is definitely better than sitting. If you had to choose between the two, standing is definitely better than sitting. But you have to think about the load profile that we talked about. So if you're standing in one place for 8 hours, does that make you not sedentary? The bottom line is you're just changing the load profile. You're changing the load profile of sedentarism from standing in one place to sitting. Right? Obviously, it's better than sitting, but you'll fatigue at some point, and the load profile will change to maybe dropping a shoulder and a hip into a comfortable position, or still slouching more. All right, so standing's great, but if you're going to go to a standing desk, then you have to have some movement vitamins throughout the day as well. And it's the reason I sit on the ground and work, because I just find myself moving more, and I find myself less stiff during the day because I'm essentially working on mobility. And one of the best movement coaches are kids. I always observe and watch my kids read and play and what they do, and they get into positions like this that you see on the picture. That's a fantastic mobility movement right there, right? It's like a one-leg lunge with the back foot plantar flexed. So it's like you're working your muscles in completely different ways, and it's what we should do more of. And it comes down to hardware and software. All right. So if we look at our body like a machine, the body it's much more than a complex mechanical machine, because we have a brain. But it can sometimes be helpful to simplify things to make it easier to understand. Most people today can understand the hardware-software dichotomy because it relates to technology. So if we find it helpful to start by getting them to understand the body in a similar way, it's going to be helpful. So what's the hardware? The hardware is the parts, and the software is the programming. So both elements are equally important, but we have found to obtain the best results, it's almost efficient to start with hardware. If your joint is stuck and lacks prerequisite mobility, it's going to be hard to program optimal movement patterns. Begin with freeing up mobility, which would be hardware, and then it can start by ingraining better movement patterns, which would be a software update. And we have to realize that movement is a fundamental need. Without adequate movement, we suffer. It's a fundamental need, and it's optimal for mental and physical health. If movement is a fundamental human need, we need to live in a society that revolves around the lack of movement and understand that there's an inherent mismatch between biology and culture. We need to get away from this modern culture of static positioning. We need to go back to the way things were. Right now, we sit for meals. We sit at work. We sit driving. We sit at meetings. We sit on couch. Right? We force our kids to sit all day. We are putting this danger of too much sitting onto ourselves. But the fact is we're going against our nature, what we want to do. Right? So the first thing we need is awareness. And once we make people aware that movement is fundamental, that it's part of our biology, it will be a little bit easier to help people incorporate into their daily life. And like anything, small steps are key. Small steps accumulate into massive change, but it has to have consistency. So help someone remove the lack of movement from their life and help them reclaim movement, reclaim natural movement, and make them understand it's a fundamental need and help people sit less. If we can do that, we are going to make a substantial difference in our culture, in our society, in our country. And as health advocates, kinesiologists, that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that movement is a priority. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll put up, as I do, movement discussion board. I would love it if you guys can throw some discussions onto the movement board. Let me know what you think about this lecture. Let me know what you think about the movement culture, natural movement. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Okay, because I think this needs to be a fundamental part of kinesiology. This right here, movement, natural movement, creating a movement culture. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.